Thanks for the friendly welcome and introduction, and the ride from the airport. Appreciate that. Hey everybody, it's great to be back in the Queen City. I was on a plane full of sad people coming over from Alberta today, but you've raised my spirits. Special thanks to my friends from the legislature. It's great to see you, and I know your people talk all the time, and your time is busy, so I'm flattered that you're here today. I want to talk about Canada's oil sands a bit. But I think everything I'm about to say, even though it's a little bit Alberta-centric, I think it actually applies to Saskatchewan as well. Not just because you have oil sands in your northern province, but I think if you listen to some of the things I'm about to say, you might in your own mind be able to apply them to other industries here. The uranium industry, potash, other things that come from the earth that are criticized often by foreign lobbyists who want to tell you what to do better. So I think the oil sands are very much of interest to Saskatchewan. There's an enormous number of Saskatchewan people working in the oil sands. But I think there's a larger application as well. I started writing about the oil sands by accident. I don't know anything about the oil sands. I'm not in the business. No one in my family is. I was actually in Ottawa at the Ottawa Writers' Festival talking about my last book, about freedom of speech. And they said, look, you're here anyways. There's some guy in the basement talking about the oil sands. You're from Alberta. You're an expert. Go make it a panel. I said, well, I don't know anything. You're from Alberta. Go. It's enough. I went into the basement, and the room was literally adorned with those graphic pictures of open pit mines that look like something out of the land of Mordor in Lord of the Rings. I call them oil sands pornography because they're so shocking. They're designed to get that reaction. And the photographer himself was there. I mean, this was not a friendly crowd. And 100 people. And I mean, I tried to be lippy at first. Oh, there's a picture of my apartment in the mud. I mean, I tried to ask some basic questions like, hey, everyone here, what's in your car? I mean, hey, photographer, did you bicycle out to Fort McMurray to get the pictures? But my arguments weren't that effective, and I think I lost the debate. But after being in that room for an hour and a half, and looking at my notes afterwards, I thought, you know, the 100 people who have just been beating me in the oil sands up for an hour and a half, they're actually not bad people. They're not evil, they're not malicious, they're not professional haters. I don't think anyone in that room worked for Greenpeace and had a vested interest in fundraising or something. I think actually, if I was honest with myself, they were the opposite. They were do-gooders. They were idealists. They were people who actually wanted to save the world. That's why they hated the oil sands. They just didn't have the facts or didn't think things through. But for me to say that they were somehow evil, it was simply being dishonest. And then I looked at my own arguments and I realized that my conservative Western property rights way of thinking wasn't clicking with them because I was talking about my own argument, my own narrative, and we weren't even having a discussion. And I thought about it, and I looked at my notes, and I thought, you know what, I'm going to try something that's tough for me. I'm a right-wing guy, but I'm going to try and defend the oil sands using liberal values. And I wrote a liberal book called Ethical Oil. Now, is it possible for a right-wing guy to write a liberal book? Well, listen, every guy in this room spends his whole life thinking, what do women want? So if a guy can try and think what a woman wants, maybe a conservative can try and think what a liberals want. And so if I truly, truly listened to what the 100 people in that room said, what their values were, what mattered to them, what motivated them, I think I could boil them down to 4 things. The first is they cared about the environment. I mean, duh, that's what they talk about. But not just the traditional environment, air, water, land. They care about carbon dioxide, which they think is the cause of global warming. And I'm a skeptic on this. I wrote a book called Fight Kyoto. But if I were to launch at them denying global warming, and I'm a skeptic, that conversation would stop right there. It would be as if I was saying, well, cigarette smoke isn't bad. That's what they would hear. And they would write me off, and they would say, he's offending my values. So the first thing I tried to do is look at the world through their eyes. But the environment isn't the only thing that liberals care about, that the critics of the oil sands care about. That's not the only measure of ethics. There are other measures of ethics too. What about, well, what's the second part of the word Greenpeace? The first is green, and the second is peace. I think liberals and progressives genuinely care about peace. Of course they do. The whole peace movement in the 70s and 80s. I think that, I mean, we can see in the idea of non-conflict diamonds. I mean, people don't want something that's involved with war. Another thing about writing like liberals is a lot of great slogans. Increase the peace. Does the way in which you produce your natural resource increase the peace? Or does it cause war, or conflict, or terrorism? That's a real liberal value. I'm not making straw man here to knock down. These are not caricatures. These are real things that the left cares about. But even green and peace is not it. Because there's a whole labor union movement. I think liberals and progressives care about how you treat the working man and woman, the guys actually in the pit with the shovel. How do you, they use the phrase economic justice. Do you pay a fair wage? I think that's a legitimate liberal value. And finally, and this is the one that's most important to me, is what about human rights? How do you treat people who are weaker than you? How do you treat minorities? How do you treat women? How do you respect gay rights? How do you treat Aboriginal people? And these four liberal values, the environment, including carbon dioxide, peace, fair wages, and human rights, are what the people in that room cared about. So instead of attacking those values, I thought I can use those four liberal values to make the liberal case for the oil sands. And here it is in 10 minutes. The environment. The first thing that gets the first thing I did when I came home from this meeting in Ottawa was I looked up the word tar in the dictionary. Because you know some people say tar sands and some people say oil sands. Well, which is it? I mean, I'm an Alberta boy and I didn't even know. Well, I looked up tar. You know what tar is? You know what tar comes from? Tar comes from pine trees. That's where tar comes from. It was used by the Royal Navy to waterproof their ships. You can also get a form of tar from coal. It's called coal tar. But there is no coal. There are no pine trees in the oil sands. The oil sands are oil mixed with clay and water and sand. If you want to be technical about it, it's called bitumen. But there ain't no tar there. Now, why would, and historically, I went back all the way to 1920, I looked at the names of the companies. They were the oil sands companies, the bitumen companies. They were never called tar sands. Why would someone use the word tar sands? Well, it's obvious. Tar sounds a little dirtier, a little messier, a little stickier. And it's a pejorative term. He's tarred and feathered. He was tarred by the accusation. The word tar sounds toxic, doesn't it? Oil, it doesn't sound like the cleanest thing in the world, but it's not as negative and pejorative as oil sands. And that's the first tip-off. If you hear someone saying the word tar sands, it's like a poker tell. That's the giveaway that the person you're dealing with maybe is just taking the truth and stretching it, just stretching it, just embroidering it just a little bit, just to see what they can get away with. They're probably the same kind of person who would tell you, for example, that the oil sands are the size of the state of Florida and it'll all be ripped up like those open pit mines in the oil sands port. Well, it is true that the oil sands, geographically speaking, are as large as the state of Florida. But only 2% of that land mass are the oil sands close enough to the surface that you can get at them like an open pit mine. The other 98% of the area will never be mined that way. You can't. You get that oil out using in situ or underground processes. One of them is called SAGD, steam-assisted gravity drainage. You pump steam in, you suck the oil out. Up above, the trees are still there, the critters are frolicking, and unfortunately it doesn't make oil sands porn suitable for the cover of National Geographic or a Greenpeace fundraising letter. Okay, well, enough about the land. What about the water? What about the water use? The mighty Athabasca River. Well, only 2% of the Athabasca River's flow is allotted to all the oil sands companies combined. And only 1% of it is actually used, and even that 1% is reduced during periods of low flow. And these new underground processes don't use fresh water at all. They use groundwater, and 90% of it's recycled. And there's even newer technology that doesn't use water at all. It's called totally here air injection. They literally inject air in, and up comes the oil from the oil sands. Okay, well, what about carbon dioxide? Again, when I went to school, we learned about carbon dioxide when we studied photosynthesis. It was called plant food. But if I were to try and make that argument to these people in that room, your stereotypical critic of the oil sands, in my mind, a 20-something student at McGill, never been west of Toronto, probably taking vegetarian studies. If you, let's call her Zoe. If you try and say, Zoe, carbon dioxide, don't worry about it, she's going to shut you out immediately. But here's what you can tell Zoe. Do not challenge Zoe's belief in global warming. The debate will end there if you do. Say, Zoe, do you believe in the threat of global warming and carbon dioxide? Why, yes, I do. Thank God, Zoe, because I have news for you. I need you on my side, Zoe. Here is a fact. Using the Obama administration's own analysis by their Argonne National Labs, the well-to-wheel, the full life cycle of the oil, from the moment you put a straw on the ground till you turn the key in your car, that full life cycle analysis, the amount of carbon dioxide per barrel of oil sands oil is lower than oil from Venezuela, is lower than oil from a place called California. California's oil is so heavy it has its own name. You know, you've probably heard West Texas Intermediate, North Sea Brent. These are terms given to a certain kind of oil. California oil is so viscous, it needs so much energy to refine. They give it its own name, California Heavy. It is more carbon dioxide, more carbon intense than oil sands oil. It had to be exempted, grandfathered from California's low emission carbon standards, because it would be outlawed if it were subject to the same laws as the oil sands. And so I would say to Zoe, look Zoe, like you, I deeply care about this world. And I'm counting on you to support me to replace higher carbon fuel from California and Venezuela with lower carbon oil sands oil from Canada. And it's not just those two countries, you know, in using this full life cycle analysis, even oil from places like Nigeria and Iraq have the same carbon footprint as Canada. How could that be? Well, in Nigeria and Iraq, they just flare all the natural gas that comes up. In Nigeria alone, $2 billion worth of natural gas here. They just flick a lighter and off it goes. You can see it from space at night. I mean, just the economic waste of it. But what about the environmental footprint? Using the Obama administration's own methods, that adds to the carbon footprint. And here's the good news, Zoe. Not only are we better right now than oil from Venezuela and California, not only are we on par with oil from Nigeria and Kirkuk, Iraq, but we're getting better every year. Over the last 20 years, the amount of carbon dioxide per barrel of oil sands oil has fallen by 38%. We're 38% more efficient today than we were in 1990. Who knows how much better we're going to be in 5 or 10 years from now? And the reason is we care about these things. How about in other countries where oil comes from? Nigeria has 2,000 unremediated toxic oil spills that will never be cleaned up. Does any other country in the world, heck, does any other province in Canada have the same remediation laws that we do in Alberta for reclaiming those open pit mines and leaving them as pristine forests? Over 60 square kilometers reclaimed already. I'm not going to spend any much more time on the environment because I quickly want to touch on the other 3 points, but I'd be happy to talk afterwards. I know folks have to go pretty soon, but I'll stick around as long as you like. We talked about the environment a bit. But that's not the only thing. If, at the end of the day, the environmental impact of a barrel of oil sands oil was the same as a barrel of oil from Saudi Arabia, well, clearly that's not the only moral criterion. If they're both the same environmentally, if we take the environmental comparison off the table, well, there's other things left. And that's the crazy thing about oil. I don't know what God was thinking, but when He was handing out oil, He gave it to all the world's bastards. There's just no other way to phrase it. I mean, if you look at the countries measured by their rankings in oil reserves, so not just where the oil's coming from today, because there's a couple of good countries that make oil, like Norway, but they're not in the top 10 list of reserves. They're running out. Their production's falling 10% a year. I mean, there are 1 or 2. There's no oil in Switzerland. I wish there was. If we were talking about olive oil, we'd be competing with Greece and Italy and our friends there. But I'm afraid it's not. We are the only Western liberal democracy in the top 10 list of countries ranked by oil reserves. Saudi Arabia is #1. We Canadians invented peacekeeping. Saudi Arabia invented 9/11. 15 out of the 19 hijackers came from there. As we saw in WikiLeaks yesterday, Saudi Arabia still is the #1 funder of Al-Qaeda. Doesn't that count for something? No blood for oil, eh? You're damn straight. You know, a few weeks ago, 230 ducks sat down on a tailings pond in an ice storm and died. Mea culpa. Mea maxima culpa. By the way, I can polish off 50 wings on wings night. So I'm a bit of a walking crime scene myself. I know that. I'm guessing a few guys in here are pretty good with a shotgun on that kind of season. But let's not talk about that. The KFC Double Down sold 1 million sandwiches. Okay, 230 birds dying by accident in an industrial situation. That is not good news. That's an embarrassment. That's a failure of the electronic scarecrow system. That is bad. But I'm not going to use the word tragedy. Because I need to keep the word tragedy sharp, like a knife that's rarely used, because every once in a while there is a tragedy in the world. And I cannot have profaned that word because, for example, Sudan, an up-and-coming oil producer joining OPEC, Sudan killed not 230 birds, but 300,000 human beings in Darfur on purpose.